get confused. Dirk Cussler writing Dirk Pitt. And then I think a question for all of us is, could anybody else ever actually write Dirk Pitt, or would they have to adopt your name? I'm serious. I think it's a really good question.
There's way too many Dirks, I think, already in the pot here. I don't know if we need to throw any more in.
Well, there's a branding thing. And the other thing, for those of you who don't know it, is that Clive was in advertising. Clive came to writing from advertising. And if you're anywhere near my age, you will remember the jingle, Ajax, the foaming cleanser, floats the dirt right down the drain. That was Clive. I said, every time I see Clive or saw Clive and still think about Clive, that jingle just goes through my head. So it was a double branding operation there.
It was, I guess. I mean, he did. I think he worked on a Budweiser ad too, and I was trying to remember what the catch line for that was. But yeah, in his advertising days in LA in the late '60s, he worked for a couple agencies and worked on a lot of big campaigns. And I think that really showed his creativity. I mean, that was his gift. I mean, he was just a super creative guy, and he transferred those skills from advertising into writing novels.
But he wasn't just a creative guy. He was an actual adventurer. Were any of you at the 80th birthday party that we gave for Clive at the Arizona Biltmore? That's right, you were, sir. And you remember all the photos of Clive doing, Dirk Pitt sorts of things. It was climbing rocks and sailing ships and, Did he parachute? Seems to me I remember. Weren't there some actual scenes where he came out of airplanes or flew in airplanes, or I don't remember. But he did most of that stuff.
Yeah. I mean, certainly did scuba diving, all his shipwreck expeditions, prospected, I guess, out in the deserts of California when he was younger. So, he liked to be outdoors. He liked to be adventurous in his own life. And certainly that made its way into a lot of the books, too.
It really did. So when you and the other authors currently writing we call it the Cussler verse, it's just easier that way. Do you all see Clive? I mean, as Dirk Pitt or as any of these characters, is he kind of there in the background?
Oh, he absolutely is for me. I mean, obviously having grown up with him as my father and starting to read his books, I mean, from the get-go, it's so clear to see him in the character of Pitt. I mean, certainly there was a resemblance to begin with, 6'3", black, wavy hair, kind of on the lean side, though less so for him later on. But just his personality shines through as well. And so, it's fun. I mean, for me, if I'm writing a chapter or a scene about Pitt and I need a description or behaviorism, I can think of my dad and say, okay, either what would he do in real life or what would he do for Pitt in that situation. And so it's not a real stretch to incorporate my memories of him into the character.
So speaking of the larger-than-life characters, would any of you care to hazard who the larger-than-life character is in the background of a book called The Corsican Shadow? Nobody? Nobody? Seriously? All right. It's Napoleon. Because he was not French. He was Corsican. And so the minute I saw it, I thought, okay, we're going to be going to France. And I have to tell you, in a really terrible scene in this book, which just scared me to death, it came very close to losing the Eiffel Tower. As Pitt and Giordano are racing in a truck filled with explosives trying to save everything, they come to a grinding halt at the foot of the Eiffel Tower. And then, I'm not going to tell you what happens then, but you really worried me. So is blowing up monuments part of the Cussler?
I guess, yes, the bigger the better, I guess. So you can't get much bigger than the Eiffel Tower. So, it was fun. It just, it worked out to have a chase scene in Paris. And we had actually visited there shortly before. My family and I went over right before COVID closed things down, and which was great because we got to go through the Louvre and Eiffel Tower and all those things, and there were very little crowds. We got right in to see everything. So it's kind of a natural, I guess, to throw that in symbolism for Paris, that he would at least make a shot at taking it down. Anyway. Well,
it's a constant quest in our Cussler book to be looking for locations that nobody else has done or monuments nobody else has destroyed so far. This is your... Do you know when Dirk, was it the last book that has the scenes in Nepal?
Yes, yeah, okay. The Devil's Sea.
So we sat down to talk about that book, and I said to Dirk, how is it that basically a maritime thriller starts out in the Himalayas in Nepal. And Dirk looked at me and he said, I did it. He said, because I knew that was one place you hadn't been.
That's right.
Well, anyway, and you did it really well. I thought it worked out super well. What brought, this particular plot to mind? Because it starts with a scene during the First World War. Second World War.
Yeah.
In the at La Havre.
Right. And originally a couple of items that kind of triggered it. One was when I was a kid, I saw a movie called "Is Paris Burning?" and I ran across the book recently and read it, and it's a riveting account of Paris in the late days of the war, when the Allies had landed 1944, and they were making their way onto Paris, and the Germans were on the verge of evacuating it, and Hitler had ordered the commandant to burn Paris on the way out. And so there was all kind of interesting sort of controversies and activities in the French underground, and the German commander at the end refused the order. Anyway, that sort of triggered some interest in what was happening, I think, in France and Paris in World War II. And I looked at some other information too, and one thing that just sort of intrigued me was going back to the start of the war. In 1939, the Germans invaded Poland, and France and Britain declared war on Germany right away. And both countries suddenly massed all their armies on the border of France and Belgium. Well, this was in the fall of 1939. The armies were there, and then nothing happened. And they went into this long period they called the phony war, where the armies were there and they were prepared to fight, but nobody pulled the trigger. And it was, I think, during this point that a lot of actions in Paris occurred to preserve some of their monuments, including the Louvre, where they went in and took out the Mona Lisa and all the paintings, boxed them up, and shipped them off to other parts of France. And then finally things broke loose in May of 40, when the Germans did finally attack. But I just thought that was sort of an interesting sort of time frame. And as part of doing some research in that, I ran across sort of an obscure biography of this fellow who was a banker in Antwerp. And in sort of that same element, actually he was caught up right at the time of the invasion in 1940. His bank dealt with all the diamond merchants in Antwerp. And as the Germans began to advance, he collected all the deposits, met down with the president, and they were going to evacuate all the diamonds that were in the bank's deposits. And so this guy got approval from he had to last minute get all these approvals from the mayor and the governor of Antwerp and the country to be able to take these diamonds and get passes to get into France. And it was interesting. I got a kick because he drove a Packard convertible of all cars. But he loaded up a big crate full of diamonds in the trunk of his car, and he beat it towards France, and he got caught up in these convoys, and he had to fight his way through the lines, with all his authorizations, and he got to Paris, and then he realized once he was there that even Paris wasn't safe, and he continued on to the south of France, and ultimately he boarded a vessel in Marseille, and when he got on the ship, he rigged a bunch of life preservers around his case of diamonds in fear that if the ship was torpedoed, and even if he died, that maybe the diamonds would be saved and somebody would find them. As it turned out, he did successfully get to England, and the diamonds were stored there. But I use that as sort of a secondary plot in the book, as sort of a chase for diamonds. Again, what happened if this case, a similar case, those diamonds didn't make it safely out and ended up in maybe some other fashion, put on another ship and disappeared. So that's kind of the other driving plot in the story, is kind of a chase for some World War II diamonds out of Antwerp that
There's been forever speculation about a big shipment of gold, Nazi gold, that is apparently or thought to be sunk in a lake somewhere. I'm trying to remember, Bavaria or somewhere. But the advantage to diamonds is that they don't weigh very much, whereas gold is incredibly heavy. So you could put all of those diamonds in a case successfully, whereas with gold, you'd be very limited by what you could carry.
Right. And then the other thing was sort of interesting is the value increase in diamonds from World War II. And I put it in the book, and now I can't remember what the number is, but it's something on the order of 50 times or even 100 times the value of diamonds today versus what they were in
Right,
1940.
and those were uncut diamonds. So, I think mostly Antwerp is in Belgium, and I've been there a couple of times, and there still is a diamond industry there. There's a diamond museum in Amsterdam, but Amsterdam is really not the locus of the diamond thing. And part of that came from De Beers in South Africa, because that was the Kimberley mines and so forth were the major source of diamonds. But now that the permafrost is, thawing and so forth, they're finding diamonds, all kinds. One of the biggest hauls is in Canada, which I love.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because, they come out of volcano glacier activity.
Oh, right.
They're tubes. And I read a book called, Matthew Hart, I think his name is, wrote a book called Diamond, which is absolutely brilliant. So if you want to know anything about diamonds, which you didn't need to know because you were just going to put them in a suitcase.
Yeah, I needed that last year, Barbara.
Right. Oh, I get it. So you're heading, instead, though, of Marseille, you're heading to Le Havre, which is one of the major ports on the channel, Le Havre and Cherbourg. And the idea is for this diamond guy to load his his diamonds onto a little coastal steamer or whatever it was, or a ferry.
Right, yeah. And that sort of plays into the cover art on the book is he arrives in a Bugatti. The port is under attack from some German Stuka divers, dive bombers. And so he doesn't make it, but the diamonds do get put on the ship. And then from there, there's a mystery in terms of where they end up.
So the ship probably sinks, right? Or otherwise there wouldn't be any reason for NUMA to be pulling up.
You have
the
to
ship.
have some sunken ships.
I know you do, absolutely true. No, it's a great subplot, but that's just part of the story. So, how do you weave all these different elements together and keep it all straight?
I don't know. I'm not sure. It's it's just a process. I'll put a rough outline together and try and develop sort of the major action scenes and maybe try and figure out where the story's going to end up. But a lot of that comes through the mechanics as I write. I'll kind of outline more heavily at say 100 pages at a time, and then get into that and do the writing. But there's plenty of points where I kind of get stuck and say, you get into a dead end in terms of following some leads, and then have to kind of work my way out of it. But a lot of it's just as you go. I mean, again, the top level outline is there, and it's just kind of filling in the details. And sometimes that goes in different directions than I kind of intend, but that's not always a bad thing.
So sometimes the real world catches up with, or you catch up with the real world. This book is just out now, but you didn't write it recently. But you actually have a group posing as Hamas attacking, but they're not attacking. Well, where are they attacking?
Well, they did attack in Israel, actually. Was I think an early chapter, and then also in France as well, in Paris.
But they turn out not to be terrorists. But I thought how interesting that you would have written a book about Hamas attack in Israel. And, that's an interesting thing about thrillers, is that very often thriller writers seem to anticipate real-life events in ways that are surprising. And so here you are. And the other part is that very often the books that they write could never equal the actual stuff happening in the world. I mean, people would just laugh if you tried to capture some of what is going on today in a book, and people would not believe it.
Yeah, it's so true. I mean, truth exceeds fiction, I think, many times in terms of its unbelievability. And unfortunately, in the world we live in, it seems to be happening more and more frequently.
So the jacket copy does indicate what a sort of part of goal of what this attacking group is. Do you feel like you want to talk about it, or do we want to keep that a secret so people will take the book home and read it?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it is a bit of a spoiler alert, I guess, maybe. So maybe perhaps we can dodge that.
Okay. But it does take you to some other places. So it takes you to Israel, takes you to Egypt. So do you, I know you've gone to some of the places that you write about, but what do you do if you're going to write about a place you haven't been?
It's just a lot of research. I mean, it's obviously the internet is a great source. I hate to admit it, but but it is. I mean, you can get on Google Earth and zero on down to a location and kind of get an idea of, say, what the terrain looks like. You know, which way do the roads go? Is there power lines? What do the buildings look like? So there's certainly a wealth of information out there. I mean, it's obviously never as good as being able to put your feet on the ground and see it up close. But I have the bad habit of visiting places after I've written about them, or become so intrigued that I want to go visit them after I've written about them. And that's certainly the case. There's a couple places in here. I've used Bermuda again, which I used Bermuda in a recent book. There's Martinique. There's places in the U.S. I will say that my wife and I did take a visit to West Point recently, again, after the fact, and there's a scene in the book that takes place at West Point as well. So, yeah, my research always seems to be kind of ass backwards, I guess.
Yeah, West Point. Have you been to West Point? It's absolutely beautiful. You go up the Hudson, and there's an interesting curve in the river, which is what it makes strategically, but nearby is a fort. So I was amazed to learn on the one time that I went to West Point that, because Lake Champlain is right above it, that we had a Navy. And if I remember right, Benedict Arnold was in charge of the Navy. He was an admiral. Is that right? Does that ring a bell? And so there was a battle in which if the British had defeated Benedict Arnold and the U.S. ships, would have really gone badly for the American Revolution. But never occurred to me that we actually, that was the sort of start of our naval adventures there.
Yeah, Lake Champlain and all that. Yeah, there was a lot of interesting battles up there. When we were there, they talked about how they had a chain. They would put a chain across the river, across the Hudson there, to prevent, I guess, the British from traveling up and making attacks. So, yeah, interesting geography there, and it had a big impact on the outcome of the war.
Well, but West Point's the Army. I mean, Annapolis is the Navy, and long way away. But we all think of Benedict Arnold, revile him as, but it turned out he was an actual naval hero at the beginning.
Right. Yeah, that's true.
Right. So, where else do you go in the book that you'd like to mention?
Let's see. I talked about Bermuda. Actually, Martinique is an interesting place that's on my radar. I would like to visit now too, having written about it as well. I've talked to some people who've been there and said it's great. Their food is wonderful because it's a French island, and very welcoming as well. So maybe the next Caribbean trip we'll have to work our way down there.
So France actually still has an empire that goes around the world. We always think of the British as having a global empire, but France still has Martinique in the Caribbean. It still has French Polynesia in the Pacific. It has Réunion in the Indian Ocean and others. So it does actually still span the globe.
Yeah, Vanuatu or a couple others in the Pacific.
Vanuatu, yeah, and also French Guiana, I think, in South America. Mm-hmm. And when we were in French Polynesia, you haven't gone there yet, have you? Because I've been there. Okay. I was really interested in that France supplies. They run the post office. They run the National Guard, whatever. There's a local council, local government, but the French also run the educational system. The food is fabulous, as you point out. And, it's interesting to me how they do it so far away. But the other thing I thought was great is the Olympics are coming to Paris in 1924, this coming year. But there's some kind of water sport or something that Paris can't actually do. So on Tahiti, they have a little spot where they are quickly erecting an Olympic village. There's only one bridge to get there. So I have no idea how that's going to work, but they were starting and working on it when we were there so they could have this one Olympic sport and still be in France.
Oh, really? Oh. And I think I read, too, that they've cleaned up the Seine River so much that they're going to have either a swimming event or something.
They are.
There. Apparently 100 years ago, everybody swam in the river, and then it's been...
No, they are cleaning it up, and they're trying to get Notre Dame rebuilt, to reopen it for the French Olympics. But this is the part that I don't like. They are going to move for security reasons. They say all the bouquinistes, all the used book stalls that line a bridge across the Seine, and they claim for security purposes they're going to have to disband them. And so the French are inclined to protest and sue at the absolute drop of a hat, putting on their yellow jackets and the whole bit. So the bouquinistes, the booksellers, are, we'll see if they're successful.
Let's hope that's a temporary ban.
I hope so. Well, they claim that if it's once dismantled, it would be almost impossible to put it back up. And I can only conclude that what they see this, I don't remember which bridge it is, but they must see that this is like the opening ceremony, or something is going to go across this bridge. And years ago, when we were in South Africa, the soccer stadium is in a really terrible place. It's down, or there's malaria and there's all this other stuff outside of Cape Town. And so we asked, why is the soccer stadium in this awful place? And they said, well, it should be up here by the mountain. But the Olympic Committee, which is why they built the soccer stadium, said it would be much more visual if it were down where you could see the water. So, sometimes these major building plans are
based on TV viewership.
They really are. So there's another you could explore Olympic corruption or see how it goes. So what do you want to say about the book?
Can I talk about the submarine?
You can talk about whatever you want.
All right. So, the funnest part for me in writing these is the historical part. I mean, that's the part I think I really enjoy the most is doing some of the research and coming across elements that can weave into the story. And one of the items I use in this one is a vessel called the Surcouf, which is a submarine that was built by the French in the 1920s. Actually, going back to Black Wind, my first book, I used a Japanese submarine. There was a class of subs built in World War II by the Japanese, and they were called I-400s. And they were very massive, big submarine, and it had a big storage unit on the top deck where they actually had an airplane. They carried a float plane, and they could surface and assemble this float plane and launch it from a catapult and use that as a means of attack. Well, these were built by the Japanese in the late 30s. Well, the French had actually built a similar design way back in the 1920s. It was a one-off ship called the Surcouf, and it was a massive submarine. It was like 3 times larger than any submarine that had been built up to that point in time. And it had the same feature. It had this covered deck where it would carry an airplane. And it also had kind of a very unusual sort of rotating gun placement. I think it was a triple barrel gun on the front too. So it was this kind of massive creation that took everybody by surprise when it set sail. And so I kind of incorporate that in the story. Now, unfortunately, by the time World War II came around, the ship was very dated, and it leaked. It had some controversy. Actually, the British tried to, as the war broke out, it sailed over to England, and there was some controversy about the British trying to capture it because they weren't sure that the sailors on the sub were going to be Free French or united with the Vichy government.
Yeah. Right.
But ultimately, it was manned by a Free French crew, and it served some convoy duty in the Atlantic in the early stages of World War II. And then it went to Halifax to be refit, and then it made a stop down in Bermuda for some repairs. And it was actually on its way to the Pacific. And there's some question, I guess, whether it was going to go to Tahiti or further east for defensive purposes against the Japanese during the war. But it disappeared on the way to the Panama Canal. And there's actually 2 theories in terms of what happened to it. There's an account that a freighter ran into a darkened vessel, which they think may have been the submarine, collided with it, but they didn't think it sank. And then the next day, there was actually a report of some American bombers out of Panama that had attacked what they thought was a German U-boat. Well, after the war, the records indicated that there was no German U-boat in the area. So it's believed the ship or the submarine sank in this area somewhere off of Panama, maybe 80, 90 miles. It might have been subject to both attacks. It might have collided with the freighter and lost some of its communication gear. And then the next day, they couldn't communicate. They were expected in Panama and they didn't arrive, maybe because of the damage. And then they were inadvertently bombed by an American bombing crew. But anyway, it's a fascinating vessel that is a lost mystery today. and would certainly be significant for the French and any other shipwreck hunters that if we could find the Surcouf, it would be recovered or discovered. So anyway, I use that in the story because I just thought it was very interesting, and of course, a submarine is always a cool thing to put in a Pitt book.
Well, and if it's French, you could hardly escape Jules Verne, right? And the whole shadow of that. So is this a potential NUMA mission to find this vessel?
It's probably a safe bet that would be the case, yes.
I love that. That's wonderful. So Clive invented NUMA, did he not? And then he made it a reality by actually funding it and setting it up?
That's true. That's true. He created it as a fictional agency in I believe, the Mediterranean Caper, I think right off the bat. That Dirk Pitt worked for is kind of like NOAA, the agency that dealt with the sea and research that allowed Pitt to be diving and working on submersibles and things like that. And as he became successful writing, he began to pursue shipwrecks, and he was interested in historical shipwrecks. He was never interested in searching for treasure wrecks. And he funded a lot of projects in the U.S. looking for actually Civil War wrecks that were kind of lost or forgotten. The Hunley, speaking of submarines, was his most famous find in Charleston. But yeah, he established a nonprofit in order to fund those projects, and he ended up calling it NUMA, National Underwater Marine Agency. That was suggested. He wasn't keen about it at first, but the folks he worked with thought it was a good idea. And so NUMA was born and still exists today. I've worked some of the projects. We continue to search for a John Paul Jones wreck over in England in the North Sea, which was lost during the Revolutionary War. So that's been a project we fooled around with since 1978, I dare say.
Sailing out of Hull, right? Or no, not Hull.
Whitby.
Whitby, right? The Dracula town.
Right.
Right. So are you the chairman of NUMA?
Yeah, I mean, it's a shoestring operation. So that and a cup of coffee, we'll order that in $1, I'll buy you a cup of coffee. But yeah, so NUMA still exists, and yeah, we put a project together maybe once every year, something like that. So we've worked with some fellows out of South Carolina, the crew that actually worked in locating the Hunley. We worked with them for years and years, a couple of great guys down there. And so if we get the right project and can arrange the funding and we'll put a project together and go after it.
So how useful is NUMA? I mean, if you read any, James Rollins, he has Sigma Force, and Brad Taylor, I can't remember what that's called, but having these kind of off the books, but structured and funded semi-military organizations really work well for thrillers, because otherwise you'd have some guy, just on the loose with no financial backing, no chain of command,
accountability,
nothing.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And of course, Pitt is now the director of NUMA, so that gives him a lot of flexibility, right, to use the agency's resources as he sees fit.
So, but NUMA has employees. So, what other NUMA characters are to be found in the Corsican Shadow?
Well, let's see. Of course, Al Giardino. Pitt never goes anywhere with his trusty sidekick, Al Giardino. We've got the computer whiz, Hiram Yeager, who works the computer resources and is key to coming up with research and historical data. Rudy Gunn is the assistant director of NUMA, who's been a long-time character as well. I think he has an appearance in there, certainly at the end. And though he's not official member of NUMA, but St. Julian Perlmutter is a maritime researcher that Clive invented in one of his early books, and a huge 400-pound kind of bon vivant fellow who's expert on marine history. So in the case of the Surcouf, he's critical in terms of identifying where to search for this lost submarine.
What about the children?
And the children appear. So, of course, Dirk and Summer are the children of Dirk Pitt, and they first appeared, I think, in Trojan Odyssey, or Valhalla Rising, maybe. One of the two.
Anybody remember? Come on. Do we remember?
I'm trying to remember which one.
I'm looking at you because you've been here a long time.
Let's call it Valhalla Rising, because Trojan Odyssey was his last solo effort.
It was the last solo of Dirk Pitt. Yeah.
Yeah. So they appeared, I think, in the book before that. So he had them in two books. So they're involved too. They get caught up in part of the efforts in, let's see, they're in the Irish Sea, I guess, in the original part. I have to remember back in the book. It's been about
been a while. There's always a question when you're writing a hero for decades or even one decade about whether the hero ages in real time. Michael Conley was with us Thursday night, and we had that discussion. It's getting harder to find something for Harry Bosch to do because he can't be a policeman anymore. So now, and then he was working as a volunteer in a cold case thing. Now he's driving the Lincoln for the Lincoln lawyer, and they're working together. So is the younger generation, was there some thought, do you think, about Dirk aging out to the point where the Dirk Jr. and Summer would take over?
I never really had that conversation with my dad. So to be honest, I don't know if that was maybe an intent. He didn't really age Pitt a great deal, I think, over the time that he wrote.
Or Al.
So it wasn't like he was ready to retire Pitt. So I don't know. I think maybe it was just maybe a way to bring in some new characters, I think, and maybe add a little youth to the stories, I guess.
So do you readers, do you mind that, or is it sort of an implicit bargain you made that you're going to pick up the book and time will have moved on, but nobody got any older except the author? Oh. No, I'm serious. Does it bother you? Because, I'm thinking about Robert Parker readers or, Tom Clancy or whatever it is. We just sort of expect events to move forward, but people don't age to go with it.
Right. Yeah. I mean, Pitt, I think, was a Vietnam veteran, I think, at the beginning. So that would theoretically.
Spencer was a Korean War veteran when Bob Parker started writing that, and I think he ended up as a Desert Storm.
You have to overlook a few early details, I guess, to keep your protagonist young.
So just to wind up, and I don't want to talk about why he's in the book, but if you're so interested in the history, how deep a dive did you have to do into Napoleon and everything around him in order to write this?
Somewhat. Actually, we talked a little bit earlier, because of the nature of the book, I actually probably did more research on Josephine than Napoleon, and found her history very interesting in its own right, because I didn't need, I guess, the way the story was structured, a great deal of background in terms of Napoleon's history and rise and all that. But Josephine factored in a large degree to the story, and I found her background equally as compelling.
No, she's a fascinating character. Right. I don't think he did well by her, but, there's some dynastic principle that seems to overtake people who become like kings and emperors. And I've always wondered why Henry VIII, who actually did have a perfectly healthy son with Anne Boleyn's older sister, why he never... because you could legitimize a child like that if you needed to. I've always wondered why he just disregarded him and went on this quest, for another era. And Napoleon,
maybe he liked younger women.
I don't know, but Napoleon did the same thing because, he and Josephine didn't have children, so we put her aside to marry Marie of Austria, and there we were.
Right, but then supposedly his last words were Josephine, so... maybe, she may have been his true love, even despite that. And I think he did take care of her, even though she had lost her official duties and title and everything.
I think he did too. So one final thing before questions. I have been to Malmaison, Josephine's home where she was retired. And in the museum there, they have some uniforms that Napoleon wore. I'm 5'2", and Napoleon was 4'8". I could not get into any of Napoleon's clothes if I had wanted to. I've shrunk to 5'1", but still. And he was really tiny, which is, people were smaller generally, so it wouldn't have been quite so dramatic as it would be today when people are taller. But he really was a very small guy. And the other thing is he didn't sleep. He was one of those people that could function on 3 or 4 hours of sleep. And one reason he got so much done is while everybody else was asleep, he was rattling around in his coach or something and working.
Yeah.
So he wore people out, that worked with him
That high
because
energy, yeah.
he was just always on the go.
And the other thing I think that the audience would appreciate is he was a prolific reader, especially in his early days. When he was in the Army, his buddies were out drinking on the weekends or whatever, and he was home reading, studying books, reading history, reading Greek, the classics, and all that. So
he was brilliant
Smart
on
guy.
government structure. He was an absolute genius at the government structure and also at the law. So France still operates on the Napoleonic Code,
Right.
which he wrote. So,
he had a
there
major
were
impact on businesses and how they operate and so forth. So, yeah, he probably gets a bum rap based on his ego, but he did a lot of remarkable things for.
Yeah, he really did. He was a great administrator, and it's unfortunate that, power overcame him.
Right.
Right.
So, well, I for one am looking forward to the Ridley Scott movie, and hopefully that'll do him justice. We'll see.
Isn't that another lucky thing? You don't have a movie of this, but you
Yeah.
have Ridley Scott bringing Napoleon back to
Nice
us.
coincidence here.
Right. Last movie with Napoleon that I can remember, Marlon Brando was Napoleon. Do you remember that? I can't remember what it was based on.
So,
Desiree. It wasn't actually a book about Napoleon, but there was an historical novel called Desiree. And Marlon Brando he was very big, the same haircut, very big, the
that's
coat.
right. I was thinking Waterloo, but that was Rod Steiger, I think.
Yeah. So, questions from all of you. We've sort of nattered around because we can't really talk about the plot without spoiling it, but here we are. So, questions, any of you'd like to ask?
Sure.
One of the fundamental aspects of many of the Dirk Pitt books is that tie-in with chapter one, the historical, and then moving on. As you're writing this, how do you tie those together? I mean, it's critical that it fits, and yet you've got the main plot going, but as you're developing your ideas, how do you tie those two together?
Okay, I'll repeat the question. The question was, how do you tie in the historical prologue sort of with the rest of the story? And generally speaking, it's the impetus of the whole story, coming up with a historical hook, and then trying to figure out the impact for today. And that's kind of a tough challenge because you can find lots of interesting historical elements or oddities that would be nice or interesting to write about for a prologue, and then the difficult part is always kind of making it relevant to current day. But normally that's kind of the front end. Start with some historical ideas and then figure out how to tie that in. And so I think that's in my case usually in the back of my mind, or at least I have an idea where it's going to go or how it's going to finish really before writing that second chapter. So I can write the prologue. And then have the hook kind of figured out how that's going to relate later in the story, and then jump into the rest of it.
Have you ever written the book and then written the prologue?
Funny you should mention that because I'm about a third of the way through the next Pitt book, and I haven't written the prologue. I know kind of what I want to do with it, but I don't have the hook figured out yet, the way I want it. So I hope it'll work, but we'll find out on the next one.
I think your question is a really good one, because if you set the hook too early, it would be very difficult to make the rest of the book work. So prologue doesn't necessarily, you have to read it first, but he didn't have to write it first, right? Right. There was another hand back there.
Yes, ma'am.
So kind of on that same thought, do you have like ideas of things for future books, different historical things or whatever that you'd like to discover? And then if so, how do you pick, okay, this is what I'm going to go with for the next book? How do you make that?
Question is, do I have a list of ideas and how do I decide? I do have a notebook where I jot things down, and there's always sort of potential plot ideas that might surface and work in another story. And same thing kind of with the historical pieces as well. But it's usually more of a kind of a give and take battle when I come down to sit down and try and come up with a new story. I'll go through some ideas and usually end up doing some historical research as well if there's something that maybe just kind of attracts my attention and that I think may have potential to work into a story. but I normally don't have it all figured out together. It's usually a battle to say, okay, well, here's maybe an interesting historical idea. What can I do with that? And in my case, it usually doesn't come quick. It's usually kind of a give and take and percolate over things and maybe, consider some other subplots or ideas or elements that may be able to tie in with that before ultimately coming up with a story outline that's going to work. Let's go back here. We missed you first.
So you're now the second generation Dirk Pitt author, and as we've talked about, you were so many years old when Mediterranean Caper was first published. And Dirk Pitt doesn't seem to age, which is great. I really enjoyed the stories. I enjoyed the historical, the current, and the kind of the future hook in there too. There was one book where he jumps on his Motorola Iridium phone. Don't ask me why that jumps out at this moment in time, but it does.
I'll just stop you there and say, because I used to work for Motorola Iridium, so that's how that got in there. All right.
So, we're all aging and everything, and musicians are aging, and they're trying to sell their libraries. What do you see as, in the real world, the authorship of the Dirk Pitt series going as you decide, okay, I want to do something else now? I mean, you probably would do this for a long time yet to come, but do you see yourself handing this off and keeping Dirk Pitt going for another generation, maybe?
Okay. Question is, where do I see Pitt going as a continuing author with that? A great question, and I don't have a good answer for that. I'm 62 years old. I'm not sure how many more of these I can create and generate. It's a difficult challenge because not only with the Pitt books, but with the other books in the series, without stepping on other people's plot lines and and action sequences. So they certainly don't get any easier to write, that's for sure. But he's such an iconic character. I think all the characters that my father created, it's hard to see a time where they're not in print. They're not stories are not being developed. But it goes back to being able to maintain the quality, I guess, and maintain the level that he established. So it's a tough question. I don't know that I have an answer. I would certainly like to see, or hope to see at some point, that I could pass the baton on to somebody else, and that they could continue to entertain readers in the future. But I'm not sure at this point I have an answer how or when that's going to happen.
It's a two-part question, too, because there also needs to be a publisher involved, who's willing to publish the books. So legacy publishing, as this is called, when the author has died and other people want to continue their characters. There's a lot of that going on at the moment. There's the Clancy series. I just heard from Brett Battles, who's going to come see us in June. He's taken over Stuart Wood, Stone Barrington, for example, which I didn't expect. In September, Vince Flynn handed off, sorry, not Vince, Kyle Mills handed off the Vince Flynn franchise here on September 11th to Don Bentley. Don had been writing the Clancy Juniors, and now he's going to be writing Vince Flynn's character, who's sorry, my age, I can't remember the name. But anyway, it goes on, but it goes on as long as there are people to write them, but also as publishers decide there's enough audience interest. And there's an agent in England called Andrew Wiley, referred to as the Jackal, who's almost his entire stable is legacy. He goes for estates. And I always say to new authors when they're here, think about whether you want anybody to write your character when you're no longer able to do it. And you need to create a literary estate and have a literary executor who is not related to you and therefore will not profit directly from it to make that decision. If you don't really want anyone else to ever write your characters, then you need to take care of that. And unfortunately, all authors are not business people. You are, because you came from a financial background, if I remember right, working. But a lot of authors never think about stuff like that. And then it's kind of up to their relatives and their agents and publishers. So some of these legacy estates will survive, some of them won't. Ludlam is another one.
Right.
Trying to think.
Well, they're still going.
Yeah. And then, as I say, Stewart just died. So that's just coming into, fruition. So Clive figured all that out well before he died, in the sense that he set up, what you all are doing, and that didn't come up. But I'm not sure whether you've taken that another step forward, nor do you need to answer that question. But it's an interesting one.
It is an interesting question.
Yeah. Sorry, I just thought I'd explain the mechanics of it because it's not particularly transparent. Who else has a question?
First of all, thank you for keeping all the lines going here. I enjoy all the books. A couple of weeks ago when David Baldacci was here, he was talking about the problem with AI, with ChatGPT and OpenAI, and they're loading all the books from multiple authors into that system to be able to generate books. Is that something you're seeing with these characters?
The question was, are characters being loaded into the AI chat? Is it RBT? GPT? I never get the acronym right. With our books. Yeah. Actually, it has been brought to our attention that, at least in one instance, it's been tapped into. I think one of the Clive early books, I believe. We've made our publisher aware of it. It's just sort of an early stage with that, and I think it's going to be an interesting fight in the future. But certainly it is definitely a concern, because sure, all writers would not want their material taken and be used to somehow propagate a new story based on their input without authorization. So it's a sticky issue. It's a very timely issue, and I think there's going to be some battles ahead on that.
There's going to have to be some real definition of what is fan fiction. Do you all know that 50 Shades of Grey, it was fan fiction? It was just ripped right out of Twilight. And, it's a constant problem for successful authors, is how to deal with fan fiction. So AI is just going to take that one up.
Magnitude,
Yeah, a notch. Pat, you're lurking over there. Do you have audience questions?
I do. Actually, I have a really heated debate going on YouTube right now. So, right now, the audience is discussing whether or not you're as opposed to movies with Dirk and the other NUMAverse or Cusslerverse authors, characters as your dad was. Are you open more to a Hollywood adaptation?
Yes, I would be open. For some reason, I always go back to the Organ Files. To me, would just be a perfect TV series. I think it just sets itself up for something that could be really visually great as an ongoing series. I'm more protective of Pitt, I guess, just because of the experiences my father had before with Hollywood. And so, certainly I'd be first to say I'd love to see a big screen depiction on the order of the James Bond movies, that if they were done, with the Pitt characters. But getting to that point, I think, is a difficult task. And even as my father tried so hard on Sahara to get what he wanted and maintain his vision on the screen, and it just deviated so far from that, even though he had a lot of safeguards.
Why did it deviate so far? I've never watched Sahara, so I don't really know why it was such a disaster from Clive's point of view.
Script and casting and acting, I think. I mean, a lot of it was casting in my mind. And my father, he talked about Steve Zahn was the actor chosen for Al Giardino. And Dad said he came and visited him in his office and said, Steve Zahn is sort of blonde-haired and blue-eyed. He said, well, I'll bulk up, I'll dye my hair dark curly brown, and I'll wear dark contact lenses, to play the character. And I don't believe he did that in the film. And the persona was just totally unlike Al Giardino in the stories. Rainn Wilson, who's on The Office, was Rudy Gunn, and just played a total blithering idiot. I mean, so the characters were just terribly dumbed down, and then the screenplay, didn't follow the book, which would obviously when you get to a movie, you have to cut a lot out of the book anyway. But it just wasn't a serious attempt, I think, to follow the book and to be a serious movie, I think. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of fun in the stories. The father was the first to want to make sure the stories are fun and entertaining. But I think they just were, in part, targeting maybe a younger audience and just sort of lost sight of what the books were about. So even though he had script and cast approval, it didn't come out the way he wanted. So,
However, you guys are living proof on a subject that Michael Connolly and I talked about the other day, and I've been talking to the Wall Street Journal and some other things about. Good television may increase book sales because people, who haven't read books may watch it and really like it. Bad television does not seem to hurt book sales. I mean, if you saw it, you're still here, right? Even if Sahara was a bomb. And I find that really interesting that, there are a number of authors, John Sanford, Bob Parker, Sarah Paretsky, terrible movie adaptations, but it didn't actually hurt them as authors or hurt their books. So I think Clive, in a way, it was so personal to him. It didn't hurt his book sales, but it just upset him.
Yeah, but I think true. I mean, but still, say in the Pitt movies, I mean, you don't want too many. You want too many repetitive failures, right? If you go back and the third one's a bomb too, then
No, I do see it. Another question? You're still over there.
I am. I'm still hiding out. Another question online that Facebook would like to know. Tracy Smith, I believe, is his name. He'd like to know if you or any of the other Cusslerverse authors were offered the opportunity to go on to a NUMA expedition. Would you want to do that? Would that be something that would interest you, and would you want to write about it?
Well, I've been on lots of NUMA expeditions, so I guess. Yeah, and obviously the other co-writers are welcome to join me next time around. Bring your seasick pills, and I'll meet you guys in the North Sea, okay?
Right. Anybody else here in the audience?
How about teasing us with your next publication involving Dirk Pitt? What will it be about?
It's always hard. Somebody asks to describe the book that you're writing or that you're working on, and it's
too early to tell.
It's too early. Yeah, I'm sorry. Let me get a little further into it. And then,
Actually, I'm really impressed that Dirk remembers as much of this book as he does, because our experience is that when the author gets here with whatever the book it's just published, they're at least one book ahead, sometimes two, and truly can't remember because your mind has gone off into a whole new world, right?
I remember that last time you asked me something about one of the characters in the last book, and I just totally drew a blank because I couldn't remember what.
That's why I'm here, in part. I have just read the book, so it makes it easier. Anyone else? Oh, two more.
Yeah, you had mentioned earlier, of course, Dirk Pitt is very similar to your dad, Clive, and all his other characters that are in most of his other books, like Al Giardino, and as you mentioned, all the other characters. Are there, are they people that he knew in the past, or are they completely made up? Or was Al Giardino maybe your dad's friend back in, 1952 or something?
College roommate.
Boy, you are very.
You could say, oh yeah, that was Bob Jones, and and he had a good buddy named whatever type thing. Or were they completely just made up there?
Yeah, no, you kind of hit it on the head. Question was, were any other of the characters in the books real people that my father knew? And the only one that was Al Giardino. And in fact, he was an Air Force buddy of my father's when he served in the war, served in the Air Force during the Korean War. They were both stationed in Hawaii, and he was a short little Italian guy from New Jersey who was quite a character.
Is that his real name, Al Giardino?
It is, but it was spelled differently. I think he spelled it. I think his name was actually Giordano. And so my father changed the spelling of the name. But other than that, dead on. I met him once or twice late in his life, and he was sort of true to character. So I think that's the only one that pops into mind right now in terms of the recurring characters that was definitely based on a real person.
I want to thank you for asking that question, because I meant to start out by saying today is Veterans Day, and to send a salute out to all the people who have served, such as your dad and his roommate. And I forgot. So I really appreciate your asking that question. Thank you. Did you have one too?
My question is about NUMA. So, did your father set up or set aside funding for that to continue, or how does that continue to be funded? I know you said it's a nonprofit, but how does that continue to be funded? Yeah.
By begging for money mostly. We
You can get some from us.
Yeah, I mean, we have a website. We still sell some merchandise on there, so that helps fund it. We've got actually Doxa's helping us out. I'm wearing a Clive Cussler edition Doxa watch that was issued earlier this year, and so they are donating a portion of the proceeds to fund NUMA as well. And then I kick some money in as well when it's time to write the checks for
I think
charting
when
a boat.
Clive started it, some of his royalties he assigned to NUMA, didn't he, or something like that? There was something he did to set up the original funding. I'm trying to remember.
Yeah, I mean, he funded most of it personally.
Right. No, he did. Right.
The other authors that are in this Cussler verse, so do they have to are you in charge of the Cussler verse, where they have to come to you and say, this is what we want to do? Like, I'm a big fan of the Fargos, and does the author have to come to you and say, this is what we want to do with the Fargos, the next one, or is it kind of up to them to? How do you?
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of working with the other co-authors, they'll come with a proposal for the book, and we'll swap some ideas, and then they'll go back and make an outline, and we'll review that as well.
But do you give the final say for that?
Yes.
Well, it goes one more step, because then it has to go to the publisher, and there's an editor at the publisher who may or may not decide to chime in.
Right. Yeah, and I also would add my agent also plays a critical role in reviewing those as well.
But part of it, if you think about it, with all these different books, part of the job is to try to make sure that nobody steps into anybody else's story or landscape, or, as we said earlier, blows up anything that somebody else has already blown up.
Right.
It's hard, is that you keep writing, because you're just like covering the world.
Yeah, I don't know if I mentioned earlier when we were talking that. Graham Brown completed a book called Dark Watch, and I don't think it had gone to press yet. And Mike Madden had come with a proposal for an organ file story, and it was almost verbatim. The plot driver was almost verbatim what Graham had just written about, and so it's something we have to watch out for and be careful of, because it's reality. I mean, we've used so many plots. It's hard not to trip over ourselves.
In so many places. I mean, you just pointed out you're back in Bermuda.
Mm-hmm.
In this book, you sort of have to cycle back often to places you've already written about, but in a different context.
Right. Yeah. I mean, at some point, you've covered the globe a couple times over, so it's hard to avoid that.
So to the discussion earlier about casting, and you think the Oregon Files would be a great TV series. Who do you have in mind for Juan Cabrillo?
Question is, who do I have in mind for Juan Cabrillo if the Oregon Files went on TV? I don't have an answer to that. Dirk Pitt's tough enough, okay, so I haven't gone down the list of Juan Cabrillo yet. But,
what often happens too is these projects take so long that the guy that you initially picked that would be great is now too old. I mean, that happened with Doug Preston and George Clooney. George bought the rights to do The Monster of Florence, and then stuff went on, and then George aged out of being able to actually. He wasn't going to be the monster. He was going to be the other side. But that happens too.
True.
Yeah, that you can't. I mean, original casting may not work by the time something actually comes in.
Yeah, or something bad happens to your actor, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, no, it could be bad. Well, thank you. We probably left your butts in chairs too long. Wasn't it great? Any of you went to the Connolly event? They actually had padding in the pews at the church, so it wasn't nearly as squirmy as this one. But 60 minutes is usually long enough. So I want to thank you for your attention. I'm going to ask Amy, how many tickets did we do? Thank you. So I have a book to give away. And I have to say, this is a personal thing. Those of you who have a number are all eligible for this. We had a local author named Frederick Ramsey who, if he had not been a minister, would have been a born criminal. He was absolutely, I gave the eulogy at his funeral, and I said that, which really shocked his family and relatives, but it was true. Fred was a genius for plots, and he wrote a series because his son is actually involved in the government in Botswana for reasons I have never known. And he wrote a trilogy set in Botswana with a game warden and all. And there was always an animal at the heart of it. And this one, Danger Woman, which I think is a great title, involves a hyena, which is not a lovable character, but nonetheless a fascinating one. And I love this book. So if you will pick a number between, what'd you say, 1 and 28? Thank you. We'll give this book away.
Oh, just pick a number?
Yep.
17.
Person has to be here to win. So if you don't have 17 on your ticket, we'll get to pick another number. Did you look? Oh, yes? No. Do you know that, now that we've done that, 17 is the number that authors most often call? Do not ask me why. I'm serious. It really is. All right, so now that you know that, it just happens all the time. I have no idea why. It's the lucky number. Pick another one.
All right, 12.
Well, I may have to just throw
All right,
this
Barbara.
book up in the world.
You better pick the next number.
All right, what am I going to pick? 25. Oh, look at you. You must have been sending vibes at me, sir. So if you like this, there are 2 earlier books. I absolutely love them. One of them is a lion, and one of them I'm trying to remember is a gorilla, I think. Anyway, Fred sadly died, as you might have gathered when I said I did the eulogy at his funeral, so we can't access his books anymore, but they were great. Thank you all very much for coming. Let's give Dirk a round of applause.
Thank you very much.
And since he's conveniently at photographing height, we're going to just let him sign books here at the table. If you'll line up